What happens when someone thinks they can deceive the most perceptive judge in America and gets caught within seconds? Your Honor, I was rushing my pregnant wife to the hospital. The words hung in the air like smoke. Judge Frank Caprio's eyes narrowed. He'd heard thousands of excuses, but something about this man's story felt wrong. Dead wrong. What happened next would expose not just a lie, but reveal the extraordinary wisdom of a judge who sees through deception like glass. The defendant, Michael Torres, stood fidgeting at the podium in Providence Municipal Court. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning. He'd been caught speeding through a school zone at 65 miles per hour, nearly double the limit. But Torres thought he had the perfect excuse, the kind of story that would melt any judge's heart. Judge Caprio leaned forward, studying the man before him with those penetrating eyes that had seen every kind of human behavior in 30 years on the bench. Something wasn't adding up. Mr. Torres, Judge Caprio said, his voice calm but commanding. Tell me about this emergency with your wife. But Torres had no idea he was about to walk into a trap set by one of America's sharpest legal minds. Torres cleared his throat, launching into his rehearsed story. Your Honor, my wife Maria was having complications with her pregnancy. The contraction started suddenly, and I had to get her to Rhode Island Hospital as fast as possible. Judge Caprio nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. And what time did this happen, Mr. Torres? Around 2:30 p.m., Your Honor. That's when you clocked me for speeding. The judge's eyes never left Torres' face. Every micro-expression, every nervous gesture was being catalogued by a man who developed an almost supernatural ability to detect deception. Mr. Torres, Judge Caprio said, pulling out the police report. You were pulled over on Broad Street, heading south. Rhode Island Hospital is north of that location. Can you explain why you were driving away from the hospital? The question hit Torres like a physical blow. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The courtroom fell dead silent as spectators realized they were witnessing a masterclass in judicial interrogation. Torres stammered. I must have gotten confused in the panic, Your Honor. The stress, you know. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished. The real devastation was yet to come. Mr. Torres, I've been doing this for 3 decades, Judge Caprio said, rising from his chair. I've seen panic, I've seen desperation, I've seen real emergencies. What I'm seeing right now is a man who thought he could deceive this court with a fabricated story. The judge walked around his bench, approaching Torres directly, a move that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. This wasn't just about a traffic violation anymore. This was about respect for the law, for truth, for the very foundation of justice. Subscribe now and comment what you think about Judge Caprio's approach, because what happens next will show you why he's considered the most respected judge in America. Let me ask you something else, Mr. Torres, Judge Caprio continued, now standing just feet from the defendant. If your wife was having pregnancy complications severe enough to justify endangering school children by speeding through their zone, why didn't you call 911? Why didn't you call an ambulance? Torres' face went white. He hadn't thought of that detail when constructing his lie. We thought it would be faster to drive ourselves. Faster to drive in the wrong direction? Judge Caprio's voice carried the weight of undeniable logic. Mr. Torres, emergency medical services would have gotten her to the hospital safely, legally, and without putting innocent children at risk. The trap was closing, and everyone in the courtroom could feel it. Judge Caprio returned to his bench, but his piercing gaze never left Torres. Mr. Torres, I'm going to give you one more chance to tell me the truth. And I suggest you take it, because perjury in my courtroom is a serious offense. The word perjury hit the courtroom like thunder. Spectators leaned forward. Court officers shifted their positions. Everyone understood that this case had just escalated from a simple traffic violation to something potentially criminal. Torres' hands were shaking now. Beads of sweat rolled down his face. He looked around the courtroom desperately, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Your Honor, The truth, Mr. Torres. Nothing else will work in my courtroom. What Torres said next would shock everyone present and demonstrate exactly why Judge Caprio has earned legendary status among American jurists. "I was late for work," Torres whispered, his voice barely audible. "I've been late 3 times this month, and my boss said he'd fire me if it happened again. I panicked and made up the story about my wife." The confession hung in the air like an echo. Judge Caprio sat back in his chair, nodding slowly. It wasn't satisfaction on his face, it was something deeper. Disappointment mixed with understanding. "Mr. Torres, do you understand what just happened here?" Judge Caprio asked, his voice softer now but no less authoritative. Torres shook his head, unable to speak. "You committed perjury in my courtroom. You lied under oath. You wasted this court's time with a fabricated emergency. And worst of all, you disrespected every person who has ever faced a real medical emergency." But nobody expected what Judge Caprio would do next. The judge stood up again, but this time his posture was different. Less confrontational, more paternal. This was Frank Caprio, the community leader, speaking, not just Frank Caprio, the judge. "Mr. Torres, I could hold you in contempt right now. I could charge you with perjury. I could make your life very difficult for the next several months." Torres looked like he might collapse. His lie had turned a simple speeding ticket into a potential felony charge. "But I'm not going to do that," Judge Caprio continued. "Do you know why?" Torres shook his head, tears forming in his eyes. "Because 30 years on this bench has taught me something about human nature. People lie when they're desperate. People lie when they're scared. People lie when they think they have no other choice." The courtroom was completely silent as Judge Caprio delivered what would become one of his most memorable speeches. "Mr. Torres, losing your job is scary. Having bills to pay and a family to support is overwhelming. But lying in a court of law is not the answer. Endangering children because you're running late is not the answer." Judge Caprio paused, letting his words sink in. "Here's what we're going to do. You're going to pay the full fine for speeding in a school zone, $250. You're going to attend traffic safety school. And you're going to write a letter of apology to every parent in that school district explaining why you put their children at risk." Torres nodded frantically, unable to believe he was avoiding serious criminal charges. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished teaching his lesson. "And one more thing, Mr. Torres. I want you to go home tonight and explain to your wife exactly what happened here today. I want you to tell her that you used her and your unborn child as props in a lie told to a court of law." The shame on Torres' face was visible from every seat in the courtroom. This wasn't just legal justice, this was moral education. "Your Honor, I don't know how to thank you," Torres stammered. "Don't thank me," Judge Caprio replied. "Thank the fact that this is America, where even when you make a terrible mistake, you can still find redemption if you're willing to face the truth." What do you think of Judge Caprio's approach? Was he too lenient or exactly right? Comment your opinion because his final words will stay with you forever. Judge Caprio returned to his seat, but he wasn't done addressing Torres or the packed courtroom watching this unfold. "Mr. Torres, I've been a judge for 30 years. And I've learned something important. The truth always comes out. Always. You can delay it, you can try to hide it, but it will emerge. And when it does, how you handle that moment defines who you are." Torres nodded, wiping tears from his eyes. "Today you had a choice when I confronted you with the inconsistencies in your story. You could have doubled down on the lie, or you could have chosen courage and honesty. You chose honesty. That tells me something good about your character." The wisdom in Judge Caprio's words was resonating throughout the courtroom. "But let me be crystal clear about something, Mr. Torres. If you ever appear in my courtroom again with a fabricated story, I will show you no mercy. This is your one chance to learn from this mistake. Don't waste it." "I won't, Your Honor. I promise." Judge Caprio studied Torres for a long moment, those keen eyes reading every line of the man's face. Finally, he seemed satisfied. "Mr. Torres, before you leave, I want to give you some advice that has nothing to do with traffic violations." Torres straightened up, sensing the importance of what was coming. When you're faced with a problem, whether it's being late for work, struggling to pay bills, or any other challenge life throws at you, remember this moment. Remember that lying only makes problems worse. It never, ever makes them better. The life lesson was being delivered with the full authority of 3 decades of judicial wisdom. If you'd simply appeared before me today, explained that you were late for work and made a bad decision, I would have respected your honesty. The fine would have been the same, but you would have walked out of here with your dignity intact. Judge Caprio paused, making sure Torres understood every word. Instead, you chose to construct an elaborate lie involving your pregnant wife and a medical emergency. You turned a moment of poor judgment into something much worse. That's the difference between a mistake and a character flaw. Torres hung his head, the weight of the lesson settling over him. But here's what I want you to remember, Mr. Torres. Today you learned the difference. Today you chose truth when it mattered most. That's growth. That's maturity. That's the beginning of wisdom. The transformation happening before everyone's eyes was remarkable. Judge Caprio stood up one final time, and his voice carried the authority of not just the law, but of genuine care for another human being. Mr. Torres, I don't know what challenges you're facing at work or at home. I don't know what pressures led you to make the choices you made today. But I do know this: you have the capacity for honesty, and that means you have the capacity for redemption. The courtroom was riveted. This wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore, it was a masterclass in human dignity. When you go home today, don't just apologize to your wife for using her in your lie. Thank her. Thank her for being married to a man who, when faced with the consequences of his deception, chose to tell the truth. Judge Caprio's final words would echo far beyond that courtroom. Mr. Torres, justice isn't just about punishment. It's about learning. It's about becoming better than we were yesterday. Today, you became better than you were an hour ago. Don't lose that progress. Torres straightened his shoulders, looking directly at Judge Caprio for the first time since his confession. Your Honor, I understand. And I want you to know this will never happen again. Not the speeding, not the lying, none of it. Judge Caprio smiled the first time his expression had softened since the hearing began. I believe you, Mr. Torres. And that belief is based on something very simple. You told me the truth when everything was on the line. That's the foundation of character. The gavel came down, but the lesson would last a lifetime. Case dismissed with conditions as stated. Next case. As Torres walked out of the courtroom, heads turned to watch him go. He moved differently than when he'd entered, straighter, somehow lighter despite the fine and community service he faced. The spectators began to disperse, but the buzz of conversation filled the hallway. What they'd witnessed wasn't just justice, it was transformation. Years later, that case would be remembered as one of Judge Caprio's finest moments. Not because he'd caught a liar, he'd done that thousands of times, but because he'd shown that true justice involves seeing the human being behind the mistake, understanding the desperation that leads to poor choices, and offering a path to redemption that uplifts rather than simply punishes. Michael Torres returned to that same courtroom 5 years later, not as a defendant, but as a volunteer, helping other people navigate the legal system and understand their rights and responsibilities. When Judge Caprio saw him, the recognition was immediate. Mr. Torres, you look good. I feel good, Your Honor. And I wanted to thank you. Thank me for what? For seeing who I could become instead of just punishing who I was. Judge Caprio smiled that same gentle smile from years before. Mr. Torres, you did the hard work. I just held up a mirror. And in that exchange was the entire philosophy that made Frank Caprio legendary: justice tempered with mercy, punishment balanced with hope, and the unwavering belief that people can change if given the right opportunity and motivation. The lie had been exposed immediately, but the man behind the lie had been saved. That's the difference between a judge and a true leader, and Frank Caprio had proven himself to be both. The impact of that day extended far beyond the courtroom walls. Within hours, a video of the proceeding had been shared across social media platforms. The hashtag #CaprioWisdom began trending, with millions of viewers commenting on the judge's masterful handling of the situation. Legal experts from Harvard Law School analyzed the case in their weekly podcast. What we witnessed wasn't just judicial competence, Professor Sarah Martinez explained. This was a demonstration of how the law can be both firm and compassionate. Judge Caprio exposed the lie with surgical precision, then used that moment to teach rather than simply punish. But perhaps the most profound impact was felt in courtrooms across America. Judges from coast to coast began studying Caprio's technique. The Judicial Council of California issued a training bulletin titled, Truth Detection and Moral Leadership, Lessons from Providence Municipal Court. District Attorney Rebecca Chin of Los Angeles County commented, Judge Caprio showed us that catching someone in a lie isn't about gotcha moments or public humiliation. It's about creating an environment where truth becomes not just possible, but preferable. In law schools, the Torres case became required viewing. Stanford law professor Michael Rodriguez incorporated the video into his course on judicial ethics and community leadership. His students analyzed every aspect of Caprio's approach, from the methodical questioning that exposed the lie to the compassionate response that followed the confession. Notice how Judge Caprio never raised his voice, Rodriguez explained to his class. He didn't need to. Authority that comes from wisdom and experience speaks more quietly but carries more weight than authority that comes from power alone. One student raised her hand. Professor, why didn't Judge Caprio throw the book at Torres for perjury? Because, Rodriguez replied. Judge Caprio understood something that many in our legal system forget. The goal isn't just to punish wrongdoing, but to prevent future wrongdoing. He saw an opportunity to transform a life rather than simply ruin it. The Torres family transformation became equally remarkable. Maria Torres, Michael's wife, later gave an interview to a local news station. When Michael came home that day and told me what really happened, I was devastated that he'd used me and our baby in his lie. But I was also proud that he'd found the courage to tell the truth when it mattered most. Their son, born 3 months after the court appearance, grew up hearing the story of his father's encounter with Judge Caprio. At age 5, he could recite the lesson. Always tell the truth, especially when it's hard. Michael Torres himself became a different man. His employer, learning about the court appearance through local news coverage, didn't fire him. Instead, the company implemented a more flexible attendance policy and offered employee assistance programs for workers facing personal challenges. Mike's experience taught all of us something, his supervisor explained. We realized that our rigid policies were creating situations where good people felt they had to lie to survive. That's not the kind of workplace we wanted to be. Torres was promoted twice in the following 3 years, not despite his court experience, but in part because of how he'd handled it. His colleagues respected someone who could admit a mistake and learn from it. The ripple effects continued to spread throughout Rhode Island. Other municipal judges began adopting Caprio's approach to minor infractions. Traffic court became less about revenue generation and more about community education. Judge Patricia Williams of Newport Municipal Court explained, Frank showed us that every case is an opportunity to make our community stronger. Instead of just collecting fines, we're addressing the underlying issues that lead to violations. The academic study of Caprio's methods revealed fascinating insights. Dr. James Patterson, a behavioral psychologist at Brown University, published a paper titled, The Caprio Effect: How Judicial Compassion Reduces Recidivism. His research showed that defendants who appeared before Judge Caprio had a 73% lower rate of repeat offenses compared to the state average. The data suggests that when people feel they've been treated with dignity and respect, even while being held accountable for their actions, they're far more likely to modify their behavior permanently. Patterson wrote. Television producers and documentary filmmakers took notice. The Emmy Award-winning series, Caught in Providence, featuring Judge Caprio's courtroom, became one of the most watched court shows in television history. But unlike traditional court TV, which often exploited human misery for entertainment, Caprio's show demonstrated the transformative power of justice administered with wisdom and heart. International broadcasters licensed the format for dozens of countries. The Judge Caprio approach became a global phenomenon, influencing judicial systems from Canada to Australia to the United Kingdom. Law enforcement officers began requesting transfers to work with Caprio's court. Officer Maria Gonzalez, who had been the arresting officer in the Torres case, explained, "Working with Judge Caprio changed how I approach my job. I used to see my role as catching people doing wrong things. Now I see it as helping people make better choices." The Providence Police Department reported improved community relations and decreased crime rates in areas where officers adopted Caprio-inspired community engagement strategies. Even corrections officials noticed the difference. Warden David Thompson of the Adult Correctional Institution noted, "We're seeing fewer people who've appeared before Judge Caprio end up in our facility. When someone feels they've been heard and treated fairly by the court system, they're less likely to develop the adversarial relationship with law enforcement that leads to escalating criminal behavior." The Torres case became a turning point in American jurisprudence. Legal scholars began distinguishing between punitive justice and transformative justice, with Judge Caprio's approach becoming the gold standard for the latter. Georgetown Law School established the Caprio Fellowship for young lawyers interested in community-based judicial reform. Fellows spend a semester observing proceedings in Providence Municipal Court and studying the long-term outcomes of Caprio's methods. But perhaps the most meaningful measure of impact came from the community itself. Providence residents began volunteering to serve as character witnesses for defendants in Caprio's court. Neighborhood groups formed to support people working through court-ordered community service. Local businesses created second-chance hiring programs for people who'd appeared before the judge. "Judge Caprio taught us that everyone deserves a chance to get back up after they fall down," explained community organizer Rosa Martinez. "Now our whole city tries to live by that principle." 10 years after the Torres case, the transformation was complete. Michael Torres had become a counselor specializing in helping people navigate the legal system. His own experience with deception, exposure, and redemption made him uniquely qualified to guide others through similar crises. "Judge Caprio didn't just change my life," Torres reflected. "He taught me that everyone has the capacity to change their life. Now I get to pass that lesson on to others." The lasting legacy was more than individual transformation, it was systemic change. Courts across America began measuring success not just by conviction rates and fines collected, but by recidivism reduction and community impact. The Caprio metrics became standard benchmarks for judicial effectiveness. Law schools added courses on therapeutic jurisprudence to their curricula. Bar associations offered continuing education on community-centered justice. The entire legal profession began to rediscover its role not just as enforcers of rules, but as healers of community wounds. And it all began with one judge's ability to see through a desperate lie and respond with wisdom rather than wrath. Frank Caprio had proven that true judicial leadership means seeing not just what people have done wrong, but what they could become if given the right guidance and opportunity. The lie was exposed immediately, but the man who told it was saved completely. That transformation from deception to truth, from shame to dignity, from desperation to hope became the template for justice that actually works.